They mocked me for building a rat hole in the ground, but at 52 below, it's the only place left where you can still breathe.
Negative 52 degrees. The grid had been dead for 3 days, and the same men who had stood inside the warm hardware store and called his earth-bermed home a rat hole were standing on his front step now, hats clutched in their frozen hands, lips gone the colour of old slate, asking the gopher veteran to please let them inside. Jax Harlan looked at them through the open door without speaking. Behind him, the lodge held a steady 64 degrees without a single fresh log burning on the fire. Smoky stood at his hip, ears forward, amber eyes reading every face for threat, the way she had been trained to do in another country, in another lifetime. He did not say a word. Before we continue, tell us in the comments where you're watching from today. The land sat on the south slope of Bramble Ridge, 40 acres of timber and stone and frostbitten grass, and the lodge that Jax Harlan was building into the hillside looked from the gravel road below like a wound the earth was slowly closing over itself. 3 sides buried, sod on the roof, a single squat chimney rising out of the green, the southeast face open to the low winter sun, 2 small windows set deep into walls that were 3 feet thick where they met the earth, and 4 feet thick at the corners. To a man passing on the highway, it would have looked like a place where animals slept. That was, more or less, the point. Jax worked alone in the cold light of a late October morning, the kind of light that came clean and slanted through the lodgepole pines and laid itself across the frosted ground in long, patient stripes. The temperature was 28 degrees and falling. His breath rose from his beard in slow plumes that broke against the brim of his cap and drifted away into the pale air. He was packing the last of the earth onto the north berm with a flat shovel, working in steady, measured strokes the way a man works when he has nothing in the world to do but the work in front of him, and no one waiting on him to finish it. The shovel rang each time it bit through the half-frozen crust. The smell of cold dirt and pine resin and wood smoke from the small test fire he had built inside the chimney that morning hung in the air around him, like the smell of a kitchen in a house where someone is cooking for someone they love. Smoky lay 20 feet up the slope on a flat granite outcrop that gave her a clean line of sight to the gravel road below, the ridge line above, and the man working in the open. She did not sleep. She never slept when he worked outside. Her thick double coat caught the slanted light and threw it back in dark gold and ash grey, and her amber eyes moved in slow, unhurried sweeps across the perimeter she had decided was hers. Every few minutes her ears would shift independently of one another, picking up a sound from the timber that the man could not hear, and she would go still for a long beat, and then settle again when she had decided that the sound was not worth giving him. She had been doing this for him for 9 years. She would do it until the day her body refused to let her do it anymore, and then she would do it sitting down. He had bought the land in late August from a woman named Hattie Brennan, whom he had met at the small post office in Iron Hollow on a Tuesday afternoon when he had gone in to see if his last VA letter had arrived. She had been at the counter struggling with a stack of magazines tied in twine, and he had picked them up for her without a word and carried them out to her old Chevy Apache and set them in the bed and tipped his cap and turned to walk away. She had said his name. He had stopped. She had said, "I have land you should look at." That was all. She had given him the address. She had driven away. He had gone the next morning. He had walked the property line for 3 hours with Smoky at his hip and the cold mountain wind moving through the timber. And when he had come back down to the gravel turnout where Hattie was waiting in her truck with a thermos of coffee, she had not asked him what he thought. She had only said $5,000 cash, "I'm not negotiating." She had handed him the deed 3 days later and said 3 more words, "Build it well." That had been the entire transaction. He had been sleeping in his truck for the 11 months before that. A 1998 Ford F-250 with a topper over the bed, a foam pad on plywood, a battery-powered lantern, a Coleman stove he ran on the tailgate when the weather allowed, and a heavy canvas duffel that contained everything he owned in the world. He had moved the truck through 3 states and 7 counties in those 11 months, sleeping in trailheads and rest areas and the parking lots of 24-hour diners where the night manager would let him stay if Smoky stayed in the truck. He had not asked anyone for anything. He had not slept inside a building since the night he had walked out of the divorce attorney's office in Tacoma with the manila folder under his arm and the wedding ring still on his hand, and the knowledge that he no longer had a house, a savings account, a vehicle in his name other than the Ford, or a wife. Diana had served him the papers while he was at Walter Reed, 8 weeks into the inpatient program. He had been in a small white room with a window that looked out onto a courtyard with a bench and a tree, and a process server in a blue jacket had come in and laid the manila folder on the metal table beside his bed and said, "I'm sorry, sir," and had walked out. By the time he signed everything 16 weeks later, she had already moved a sales manager named Brent into the house Jax had bought with his combat pay across 2 deployments, the house his grandfather's woodwork was inside, the maple banister he had spent 4 months sanding by hand, the front door he had hung himself on the day they moved in. She got the house, she got the savings, she got the second car, he got the truck, and Smoky and a discharge envelope and a bronze star he kept in a tin. His parents had chosen her side. His father had been deep into Alzheimer's by then and could not have chosen anything. But his mother had absorbed Diana's narrative whole and had stopped taking his calls. The narrative was that he had come back from the war wrong, that he had scared Diana, that the marriage had ended because he was unstable and unsafe. He had never raised a hand to anyone in that house except to put it on his wife's back when she cried at night about things he did not know how to fix. But the narrative had a shape that the people in his small Pacific Northwest hometown wanted to believe, and so they believed it, and that had been the end of that family for him. The VA had given him a 60% disability rating for the back injury and the partial hearing loss in his left ear, and the documented PTSD diagnosis from the second deployment. They had denied the rest. He had stopped fighting it after the second appeal. He did not have the energy. There was a particular kind of tiredness that came with fighting a system that did not lose, and he had seen that tiredness eat veterans alive in the hospital hallways, and he had decided, somewhere over the course of the 11 months in the truck, that he would not let it eat him. He would just step away from the fight. He had stepped away. He had driven east. He had ended up in Iron Hollow because he had needed gas, and the gas station had been the first one in 80 miles. He had stayed in the area because the Bitterroot Range was the kind of country where a man could disappear into the timber and not be looked for. He had met Hattie because he had picked up her magazines. He had bought her land because she had looked at him the way his grandfather had looked at him once, a long time ago, and the look had been the same look, and he had not known what to do with that except to say yes. The lodge was the rest of the story. He had read about earth shelters in a paperback book he had carried in the truck for 7 years, a book his grandfather had given him in 1996 when he was 12, and had said, "You will need this someday, son," and had not explained. He had read the book 17 times. He had read about thermal mass and earth contact and frost depth and chimney drafts. He had drawn the lodge in pencil on the back of a parts catalogue the first night he had slept on the property. He had broken ground in the first week of September. He had laid the stone foundation himself, hauling each rock up the slope on a sled. He had cut the lodgepole pine for the structural timbers from the back of his own 40 acres, dragging them out with a hand winch and a borrowed mule from a man 2 valleys over who had not asked questions. He had dug the berms out of the south face of the ridge and packed them by hand. He had laid the sod on the roof in mid-October. He had tested the chimney 3 days ago, and the draught had been clean and steady, and the small hearth inside the lodge had pulled the smoke out of the room, as if the room were teaching the smoke where to go. The town had begun mocking him in the second week of September when he had gone into Iron Hollow for lumber and bolts and a roll of tar paper. Crane and Sons Hardware sat on the corner of Main and 2nd beside the Drift-In Diner and across from the post office and the small brick building that housed the sheriff's office and the building inspector and the volunteer fire department all under one roof. The store had been there for 41 years. Wendell Crane had inherited it from his father in 1994 and had run it ever since with his 2 grown sons working the floor and a teenage cashier who changed every 6 months. Wendell was 62 years old, tall and stooped, with white hair cut close, and a face that lived in a permanent expression of mild grievance. He had taken one look at Jax the first time Jax had walked in and had decided, in the way that small-town men sometimes decide things, that this stranger with the beard and the worn surplus jacket and the German Shepherd waiting in the truck outside was a problem. He had charged Jax $2.70 per board foot for white pine that he had been selling to other customers that same morning for $1.12. Jax had paid the price without comment. He had loaded the lumber. He had driven home. He had gone back the next week for a roll of vapor barrier and a box of 3-inch decking screws. Wendell had been at the register. 2 regulars had been leaning on the counter. Wendell had not looked at Jax. He had looked at the regulars and had said loud enough for the store to hear, "Bunker Boy is back," building himself a hole to hide in. The regulars had laughed. Jax had paid for the vapor barrier. He had walked out. Word had moved through Iron Hollow, the way words move in towns of 1,400 people. By the 3rd week of September, when Jax had stopped at the Drift Inn to eat a hot meal because he had wanted to taste something that was not rice and instant coffee, the waitress, a woman in her late 40s with kind eyes and a name tag that said Marlene, had brought him his eggs and his coffee and had set them down gently and had said, almost under her breath, "Don't pay them no mind, honey." He had looked up. 3 truckers in the corner booth had been staring at him. One of them had said something that contained the phrase "stolen valor." Jax had not heard the rest. Marlene had refilled his coffee and had gone back to the counter. He had eaten his eggs. He had paid in cash. He had left a tip that was 40% of the bill because Marlene had spoken kindly to him, and because in the world he had been moving through for 11 months, kindness was the only currency that meant anything. The PTSD did not have a name that he used. It did not have a shape he gave it out loud. It had triggers, and he had a list of those triggers in his head, the way a man has a list of trees in a forest he has walked many times, and he managed each one as it arrived the way a soldier manages a contact: identify, assess, respond, reset. The diesel engines were on the list, specifically the deep guttural downshift of a heavy diesel engine on a downhill grade, the sound that an IMRAP made when the gunner up top had spotted something in the road, and the driver was slowing to let the trail vehicle close the gap. He had heard that sound 100 times in country. He had heard it the day his squad mate Dunn had been killed, and the day his platoon sergeant had been wounded, and the day they had pulled the body of the interpreter out of the wadi. The sound lived in a particular room in his brain, and the room was not locked, and any heavy diesel on any downhill grade could open it, and pull him in for a few seconds before he could get back out. It happened that morning on the lodge roof. He was up on the sod, packing the last seam at the ridgeline with a tamper, when a logging truck came down the highway grade 2 miles below the property, and the driver downshifted twice in succession to hold his speed against the load, and the sound rolled up the valley and crossed the timber and reached the ridge, in the way that sound reaches across a cold, dry morning, cleaner than it has any right to be, and Jax went very still on the roof with the tamper in his hand, and the breath caught in his chest, and the room in his brain opened up, and the dust of an Afghan compound began to settle on the inside of his eyes. Smoky was off the granite outcrop and at the base of the lodge before he had registered that he had stopped breathing. She did not bark. She did not whine. She came up onto the sod roof in 3 long fluid bounds, and crossed the ridge line and pressed the side of her body against the back of his calf, and stood there, leaning into him, her weight a warm, steady pressure against his leg that said, "Here, here, here." He let his breath out slowly. He counted 4 pines on the ridge across the valley. He counted 4 rocks at the base of the chimney. He counted 4 fingers on his left hand against the handle of the tamper. He came back. The room in his brain closed. The dust settled out of his eyes. The cold morning light came back clean and slanted through the pines, and the smell of the wood smoke came back, and the work came back, and his hand around the tamper handle came back. And Smoky did not move from his leg until he had lowered himself to one knee on the sod and put his hand flat on the top of her head and held it there for the count of 10. She thumped her tail once against the sod in acknowledgement. She walked back down the slope to her granite outcrop. She lay down. She watched the road. He stood up. He picked up the tamper. He went back to packing the seam. The morning continued. The sun moved across the sky in its low arc. The temperature rose to 33 and stopped there. The wind came up out of the northwest and brought the smell of the high country down into the valley, the clean, cold smell of stone and snow and lodgepole pine that had nothing to do with any of the sounds that lived in any of the rooms in his brain. He worked through the afternoon. He did not stop until the light began to fail. When he came down off the roof, he stood at the southeast face of the lodge and looked at what he had built. The earth was packed clean. The sod had taken root in the wet October ground, and the green of it had begun to deepen. The chimney rose plumb and straight. The two small windows reflected the dying light back at him in two small squares of orange. He could not see the inside from where he stood, but he knew what was in there. A stone hearth, a 10 by 12 packed dirt floor he would lay flagstone on next week, a small bunk frame he had built out of pine, a folding camp chair, a kerosene lantern, a wooden crate with 3 books in it, and a tin with a bronze star inside, and on the wall above the bunk, a single nail that did not yet hold anything. The wedding ring was not there. He had taken it off in the truck on the side of Highway 12 outside of Missoula in the 3rd week of his 11 months, and he had put it in a side pocket of the canvas duffel, and he had not opened that pocket since. The ring was in the duffel still. The duffel was on the floor of the lodge by the bunk. The Helmand photo was in the tin with the bronze star. The photo showed him at 26 years old in full kit, standing beside Smoky with the desert behind them. And the version of his face in that photo was a face that had not yet known what it was going to know. He had not looked at the photo in a long time. Smoky came down off the granite as the light failed. She walked the full perimeter of the lodge once. Slowly, her nose lifted, her ears moving. She stopped at the southeast face beside Jax. She sat. She leaned her shoulder against his thigh. He put his hand on her head. They watched the ridge line across the valley go dark. The first star came out above the pines. The cold deepened around them in a way that was not yet winter, but was becoming winter. He could feel it in the hair on the backs of his hands. He went inside. He lit the kerosene lantern. He fed Smoky. He boiled water on the small camp stove, and he made instant coffee in a tin cup. He sat on the bunk with the cup in both hands, and he listened to the wind move across the sod roof above his head. And he did not think about Diana, and he did not think about his mother, and he did not think about the manila folder. He thought about the seam he had packed that morning. He thought about whether the chimney would draft as cleanly when the wind shifted to the south. He thought about the flagstone he would lay next week. Smoky lay down across the threshold of the lodge with her body angled so that her head was turned toward the door and her ears could pick up any sound that came up the slope from the gravel road below. That was where she always slept. He did not know how to thank her for it. He did not try. Outside, the wind came down off the ridge in a long, low sigh. The first thin scatter of snow came down with it, fine as flour, and laid itself across the sod roof and the packed berms and the dark timber of Bramble Ridge in a pale gathering dust that the dark slowly took. The lodge held its small warm light. He was a man with nothing left in the world that anyone would call a life. He was building something anyway. He did not know yet what it was going to be for. The first hard snow came down on the 2nd day of November and laid 4 inches across Bramble Ridge in a single afternoon. And by the morning of the 5th the sky over the valley had gone. The colour of an old tin roof and the wind out of the north had taken on the particular cutting edge that meant the season had stopped pretending. Jax woke at 4:45 the way he had woken at 4:45 every morning for 15 years, and he lay for one long moment under the wool blanket on the bunk and listened to the small sounds of the lodge around him, the hush of the wind across the sod overhead, the slow tick of the kerosene lantern cooling on the crate beside the bunk, the steady deep breathing of the dog laid lengthwise across the threshold of the door. The breathing did not change as he sat up. She had been awake for hours. He pulled on his boots. He opened the door. The cold came in low and dry and clean, and Smoky rose up off the floor in one fluid motion and stepped out past him into the dark blue of the pre-dawn. He stood in the doorway for a long beat and looked at the slope below the lodge. The new snow had drifted against the south berm and put a clean white skirt around the base of the structure. The ridge across the valley was a black line against a sky that was beginning to bruise toward grey. A coyote called somewhere up the timber. Smoky lifted her head. She did not respond. The coyote called again and was gone. He needed to go to town. He had been putting it off for 6 days. The supplies he needed were not catastrophic. A fresh roll of vapor barrier for the interior partition wall, a 5-gallon can of kerosene, 2 boxes of long screws, a 40-pound bag of dog food because Smoky's bag was getting thin, and groceries, but the trip into Iron Hollow was the thing he liked least about the life he was building, and the colder it got, the harder it was going to be to put it off any longer. He fed Smoky on the porch he had not yet built, threw 2 cans of beef stew into a pot on the camp stove for himself, drank 2 cups of instant coffee, banked the small fire he had laid in the hearth the night before, and pulled on his surplus jacket and the wool watch cap his grandfather had knitted for him in 1994. He locked the door of the lodge behind him with a hasp and a heavy padlock he had bought, used at a flea market in Idaho. He walked down the slope to the truck. The truck started on the 3rd try. The engine settled into its familiar rough idle, and he sat in the cab with his hands on the wheel and let the heater come up, and Smoky climbed into the passenger seat without being told and put her chin on the dash and watched the road. He drove the 8 miles into town in the slow grey light. The highway had been ploughed once in the night. The shoulders were heaped with windrows of snow. He passed a single semi going the other way, and the diesel made the deep guttural sound on the downshift that lived in the room in his brain, and he was ready for it, and Smoky was ready for it, and he took it on the chin and let it pass without going anywhere it could hurt him. He stopped at the gas station on the south end of Iron Hollow first because the truck was almost empty, and because the gas station was where he tried to do as much of his trade as he could in town. The Tate Mobile station had been there as long as the hardware store, and the family that ran it had been kinder to him than any other establishment in town, in part because the patriarch, Earl Tate, had been a Marine in Korea and had recognized something in Jax the first time Jax had pulled in for diesel. Earl was 81 years old and did not work the pumps anymore, but he sat in the office in the back behind the cash register and watched the small black and white TV and lifted a hand at Jax when Jax came in. His grandson Marcus worked the counter most mornings. Marcus was 19, lean and tall, with a fuzz of beard he was trying to grow into and a habit of making eye contact with Jax in a way that other young men in the town did not. That morning Hattie Brennan was at the dog food display. She was struggling with a 40-pound bag, trying to lift it onto her hip. She was 78 years old and she weighed maybe 110 pounds, and the bag was nearly half her weight. Her grey hair was in a single long braid down her back, and she was wearing a dark wool jacket that did not fit her, and that he understood immediately had belonged to her late husband. She had not seen Jax come in. She set the bag back down. She stood up straight and put one hand on her lower back and exhaled slowly. He crossed the aisle. He picked up the bag. He set it on his shoulder. He said, "I have it." She looked at him. Her eyes were a pale grey blue like the sky over the ridge that morning, and they were sharp, and they held his without flinching. She said, "Jax." He nodded. He carried the bag to the counter. He set it down beside her small basket of canned goods. Marcus rang her up. She paid in cash from a worn leather wallet. She said thank you to Marcus, and she said thank you to Jax, and she did not say anything else until they were both standing in the parking lot beside her old Chevy Apache, and he was loading the dog food into the bed for her. She said, "Propane is late." He paused with the bag halfway down. He set it the rest of the way. He turned to her. She said, "I called them yesterday. I called them again this morning. They said they cannot get a truck out before next Wednesday. They said the demand is up. They said other customers are ahead of me on the route." She paused. She looked at the grey sky. She said, "I have about a quarter tank left. That is 2 weeks if I am careful. The forecast is for 10 days of cold, hard cold, and I do not know if I can be careful enough." He looked at her. He said, "How much wood do you have?" She said, "Half a cord." "Seasoned. Maybe a little more." He said, "That is not enough." She did not answer. She knew it was not enough. She had not come to him for the answer. She had told him because he had asked. He said, "Are you alone out there?" She said, "I have Scout. He is 14. He is mostly deaf." She paused. She said, "I have not been alone in that house. I have just been the only one in it." He nodded slowly. He understood the difference. He said, "I will bring you wood." She looked at him for a long moment, and her eyes did the thing that her eyes had done the day she had stood in the parking lot off the gravel turnout. and told him $5,000 cash. They softened at the edges and held in the middle. She said, "I will pay you for it." He said, "No." She said, "Jax." He said, "No." "Mum, I have wood. I have more than I need. I cut more than I needed because I did not know what I needed yet. I will bring you what you need tomorrow morning." She held his gaze for another long beat. She nodded once. She said, "Tomorrow morning." She got into her truck and she drove away. He stood in the parking lot and watched her go. Smoky was beside him on the asphalt. He had not noticed her come up. He went inside the gas station to pay for the diesel and to buy his cup of coffee. Marcus rang him up. Marcus did not say anything other than the price. Marcus had a way of not saying things that Jax appreciated. Jax laid the cash on the counter. He took his change. He took his coffee. He went back to the truck. He had just put the key in the ignition when the white Iron Hollow Building Department pickup pulled into the lot behind him and parked across his rear bumper. Don Holloway got out of the driver's side. He was 54 years old, short and thick through the chest, with a greying mustache and a clipboard he carried like a sidearm. Wendell Crane got out of the passenger side. Wendell was not in any official capacity. Wendell was there because Wendell had decided he was going to be there. The two of them walked up to Jax's window. Jax rolled it down halfway. The cold air came in. Holloway said, "Mr. Harlan." Jax said, "Inspector." Holloway said, "I have been out to your property." Jax said, "I did not see you there." Holloway said, "I drove up the access yesterday afternoon while you were out. I observed the structure from the road. I have concerns." Jax did not respond. He did not need to. Holloway was going to get to it. Holloway pulled a yellow carbon paper form off the clipboard. He extended it through the half-open window. Jax did not take it. Holloway laid it on the doorframe. Holloway said, "This is a stop-work order. The structure does not meet the standards of the Iron Hollow Rural Building Inspection Ordinance. Section 7. Subtype 3. Regarding habitable dwellings on parcels of more than 10 acres in unincorporated county." Jax said, "I'm familiar with Section 7. Holloway blinked. He had not expected that. Jax said, "Subsection 3 applies to structures with municipal utility connections. My structure has no municipal connections." Subsection 4 exempts owner-built structures on agricultural parcels of more than 35 acres from the inspection requirement. My parcel is 40 acres. The subsection 4 exemption applies. Holloway's face did not move. Wendell's did. Wendell took half a step back from the truck. Holloway said, "Subsection 4 contains a discretionary clause. The county inspector may, at his discretion, issue a stop-work order on any structure that he reasonably believes to constitute a safety hazard." Jax said, "Yes, he may. He may also be required to defend that discretion in front of the county magistrate within 30 days of issuance. Are you prepared to do that?" Holloway did not answer. Jax said, "Inspector, I am not in the mood to fight you. I am not going to fight you. I am also not going to stop building. You can take your form back." He picked up the yellow carbon paper from the doorframe. He folded it in half. He handed it back through the window. "Or you can leave it on the seat, and you can come back in 30 days with the magistrate. Either is fine with me." Holloway took the paper. He did not put it back on the clipboard. He held it at his side. Wendell said, "You think you're something? Don't you, bunker boy?" Jax did not look at Wendell. He looked at Holloway. He said, "Inspector, are we done?" Holloway said, "We are done for today." Jax rolled the window up. He started the truck. He pulled out around their pickup and onto Main Street. He did not look in the rearview mirror until he was 3 blocks away. When he did, the two of them were still standing in the parking lot of the gas station, and Marcus was standing in the door of the office, and Marcus was looking at the two of them with his hands in his pockets and an expression on his face that Jax had not seen on a young man's face in a long time. It looked like contempt. It looked like contempt that knew what it was doing. He drove home with the dog food and the kerosene and the screws and the vapor barrier in the bed of the truck. Smoky sat against him in the cab. She did not lay her chin on the dash this time. She kept her amber eyes on him the entire 8 miles. Once on the long straight before the turn-off to the access road, she pressed the side of her muzzle into the side of his thigh and held it there for a count of 3. He put his hand on the back of her neck. He did not speak. He spent the rest of the day at the lodge, moving the wood from the back of his pile to the front of the truck. He selected the driest, hardest seasoned splits, lodgepole pine that had been down for 2 years, some of it dating from the previous owner, and he stacked it in the bed of the truck in tight rows the way he had been taught to stack ammunition crates. He covered the load with a tarp and tied the tarp down with paracord. He did not stop until the truck bed was full. He went inside as the light failed. He banked the small fire. He listened to the news on the small battery-powered AM radio he kept on the crate. The forecast had updated. The polar vortex that the National Weather Service had been tracking over the Yukon for the past week had broken its banks. The high-pressure system that had been holding it north had collapsed. The cold mass was descending. The forecaster's voice was tight. The forecaster used the words historic and dangerous and life-threatening and bitter cold warning. The predicted lows for western Montana over the coming 10 days were -35 to -50. Wind chills below 60. The forecaster reminded listeners that exposed skin would freeze in 5 minutes at those temperatures. The forecaster reminded listeners to check on elderly neighbors. The forecaster reminded listeners that the regional power grid was rated to -20. Jax turned the radio off. He sat on the bunk in the lantern light. He looked at the door. Smoky was already on her feet. She had been on her feet for the last 4 minutes, since the moment the forecaster had said life-threatening. She was at the door. Her ears were forward. Her amber eyes were on him. He said, "I know." She did not move. He said, "Tomorrow morning." She lay down across the threshold. She did not sleep. He did not sleep either. He lay on the bunk in the dark, and he listened to the wind come down off the ridge, and he heard, in the wind, the beginning of something he had not heard in his life before, a cold that had a sound to it, a cold that was coming for the valley and for the town and for the old woman in the clapboard house, 2 miles down the ridge with a 1/4 tank of propane and a 1/2 cord of seasoned wood and a 14-year-old beagle who could not hear the wind anymore. He decided in the dark, not for the first time in his life and not for the last, that someone else was going to come before himself. He left the lodge at 6 in the morning with the truck loaded heavy, and Smoky in the cab beside him, and the temperature already at 4 below zero and dropping. The headlights cut 2 long yellow tunnels through the dark, and the frost on the gravel crunched under the tires, and the trees on either side of the access road stood black against a sky that was beginning to suggest, somewhere very far to the southeast, that there might still be a sun in the world. He took the access road slow, in low gear, the load shifting against the tarp behind him. He turned onto the highway. He drove south for 1.5 miles. He turned east onto the unpaved county road that ran along the bottom of Bramble Ridge. Hattie Brennan's farmhouse stood at the end of that road on a low rise that gave it a clean view of the timber and the ridge and the long open hayfield that her husband had cleared in 1965, and that she had not had the heart or the back to keep up since. The house was a clapboard 2-story painted white sometime before he had been born, the paint long since gone grey and curling at the seams. It had a wraparound porch on 3 sides that sagged in places. A single chimney rose out of the steep tin roof, and a thin grey ribbon of wood smoke was rising out of it and being pulled flat to the south by the cold north wind. The windows on the ground floor were lit a soft yellow against the dark, smoke from the wood stove, a working chimney. A woman awake before dawn because she had not slept either. He pulled up to the side of the house where the woodshed stood, and he killed the engine, and he sat for a moment and looked at the house. Smoky watched it with him. The dog was reading something, her ears moved, her nostrils worked, she was cataloguing the place. She had decided something about the woman who lived in it the day before in the parking lot, and Jax could see her confirming the decision now, in the grey light, in the cold. He got out. The cold hit him the way it does at 5 below. First in the lungs as a small hard pinch, then in the cheekbones, then in the soft tissue inside the nose, and he pulled the watch cap down over his ears and tightened the collar of his jacket and walked around to the back of the truck. He had untied half the paracord when the side door of the house opened and Hattie came out onto the porch. She had on the wool jacket again and a heavy scarf and a pair of leather work gloves that were too big for her hands. Scout came out behind her. Scout was a beagle of 14 years, white in the muzzle, slow on his hips, and he stood at the top of the porch steps and looked at Jax and at Smoky in the bed of the truck, and his tail wagged twice in a low, slow arc, and he came no further. Hattie said, "Come inside first. Have coffee. Then we will move the wood." He said, "Ma'am." She said, "Jax." He nodded. He climbed the porch steps behind her. He took off his cap at the door the way his grandfather had taught him to do at the door of any house. Smoky followed him onto the porch and stopped at the threshold. Smoky did not enter buildings unless she was invited. Hattie turned in the doorway and looked at the dog and said in a voice that was matter-of-fact and respectful, "You come in too. I will not be the woman who left a working dog on the porch in 5 Below." Smoky looked at Jax. Jax nodded. Smoky came in. Scout watched her from the kitchen doorway with his ears forward and his old eyes patient. Smoky walked up to him slowly and lowered her head. She breathed against his muzzle. He breathed back. He turned around and walked into the kitchen. She followed him. They lay down together in front of the wood stove without any further discussion. Hattie watched the whole thing in silence. Then she filled 2 mugs of coffee from a percolator on the stove, and she handed one to Jax, and she sat down at the kitchen table and she said, "Sit." He sat. The kitchen was warm but not warm enough. 61 degrees, maybe 62. The wood stove was working hard, but the house was not holding the heat. He could feel the draft from the back door even 6 feet away. The window above the sink had ice forming on the inside lower corner. The walls were lath and plaster from 1923, and there was probably no insulation in any of them. He looked at the doorways and the window casings and the floorboards, and his mind made the assessment automatically. A soldier's assessment of cover and concealment translated into a builder's assessment of envelope and infiltration. The house was a sieve. The half cord of wood she had was going to last her 3 days against what was coming, maybe 4 if she let the temperature drop. He looked away from the walls and back at the woman across the table. Above the kitchen doorway, on the wall by the entrance to the small parlour, there was a black and white photograph in a wood frame. It was a photograph of a young man in jungle utilities, late 20s, lean with dark hair cut close, and a face that had not yet decided whether it was going to be a kind face or a hard one. He was standing in front of a Huey helicopter on a red dirt landing zone. He had a rifle slung across his chest and a cigarette in his left hand. The bottom of the photograph said, in faded ink, "Daniel, Pleiku, May 1969. Jax looked at the photograph for a long beat. He did not say anything. Hattie said, "That was my husband." He said, "I assumed." She said, "He died in October of 1981. Heart attack. He was 41 years old. The doctors said it was congenital." I knew it was the war. Jax did not respond. There was nothing to say to that. They drank their coffee. After a while, she said, quietly, "He bought your land in 1972. He was 32 years old. I was 28. We had been married for 4 years. He came home from his second tour in 1971, and he could not stand being in this house. He could not stand the close walls. He could not stand the ceiling. He could not stand any room with a closed door. He slept on the porch from May to September of his first year home. He slept in a tent in the side yard from November to March. In the spring of 72, he found that 40 acres on the ridge, and he bought it with his combat pay. And he told me he was going to build us a house there, a different kind of house, a house that the cold could not get into and the heat could not get out of, a house with the earth around it instead of the air. He read about it in a magazine, I do not remember which magazine. He spent 3 years reading. He started building in the spring of 1975. She paused. She set her mug down. She said, "The town called him the Gopher. They called him crazy. They said the war had broken him. Some of that was true. He did not care. He kept building. He had the foundation in by 1977. He had the walls up by 1979. He had the roof timbers in by the spring of 1980. He had not put the sod on the roof yet when he died. She paused again. She said, "I never went back up there after the funeral. I could not bear it. The 40 acres sat empty for 33 years. The structure he had built fell in on itself slowly. By the time you came to look at it, it was a foundation in the timber and some rotten wood, and you could not have known it had ever been a house." Jax thought about the property. The long stone foundation he had walked his first morning. He had thought it was an old homestead. He had built his own foundation on top of it because the stone was sound, and the placement was good, and the man who had laid it had clearly known what he was doing. He had not asked any questions of the rocks. He had laid his stones on top of theirs, and he had built his lodge on top of the man's lodge, and he had done it without ever knowing the man had existed. He set his mug down very carefully on the table. He said, "Mrs. Brennan." She said, "Hattie." He said, "Hattie, I built on his foundation." She said, "I know." He said, "I did not know." She said, "I did. I have been up to the ridge once since you started in late September. I parked at the bottom and walked up the access road. I did not come close to the lodge. I did not want to be seen. I stood in the timber on the ridge above, and I watched you for an hour. You and the dog. You were laying the stone. You were laying it the way Daniel laid it. I went home. I cried for the rest of the day. I had not cried for him in 10 years. He did not know what to do with what she had told him. He sat very still. The dog at his feet, Smoky, who had moved at some point during Hattie's speaking and had laid her body across his boots, did not move either. Scout was breathing slow and steady on the rug in front of the stove. After a long minute, Hattie said, "You are building it the way Dan would have built it. I have been watching that lodge come up out of that hillside for 2 months, and I have been watching my husband's hands move in another man's hands, and I have not known what to say to you about it. I'm not going to say it now. I'm only going to say what I came in here to say. The cold is coming. The house I'm sitting in is not going to hold against it. I do not know what to do." He said, "Come to the lodge." She did not respond. He said, "When it gets bad. When it goes below 20 below and the grid starts to fail and the stove cannot keep up. Come to the lodge. I will come and get you. You and Scout. You will not be a burden. There is a bunk. There is heat. The lodge will hold," she said, very quietly. "I cannot ask that of you." He said, "You did not ask. I'm offering. There is a difference." She looked at him for a long beat. Her eyes did the thing again. She nodded. She said, "Thank you." He said, "We move the wood now." They moved the wood for the next 40 minutes. He carried the splits in armfuls of 6 and 7, and he stacked them in the woodshed in tight, clean rows the way she showed him she liked them stacked. She worked beside him with the splits she could carry, 2 at a time, slow, methodical, and she did not stop until the woodshed was 3/4 full, and her cheeks were red with the cold, and her breath was coming hard. He told her to stop. She stopped. She stood in the woodshed with her gloved hands on her hips, and she looked at the wood he had brought her, and her eyes filled. She did not let it go further. She turned away. She walked back to the house. He finished the last of the splits alone. He was tying the empty tarp back into the truck bed when the second vehicle came up the county road. It was the same white pickup from the gas station, Holloway in the driver's seat, but this time the man in the passenger seat was not Wendell Crane. It was Sheriff Bo Reeves in his brown uniform jacket, in his department vehicle which was following Holloway's pickup at a distance of 50 yards, and the 2 trucks pulled up to the side of Hattie's house and parked in a configuration that Jax's mind read instantly before his conscious thought caught up to it, as a stack. 2 vehicles, 20 feet apart, lead and trail, doors opening simultaneously. The configuration was a patrol stack. The configuration was the configuration of a stop in country. The configuration of 2 vehicles that have come to a compound to ask questions and to be ready for the questions to go badly. His chest went tight. The room in his brain opened a 1/4 inch. The dust came up at the edges of his vision. He did not let it open further. He set the paracord he was holding on the tailgate. He breathed in for 4 counts. He breathed out for 4 counts. He counted 4 pines on the ridge across the highway. He counted 4 buttons on the tailgate. He counted 4 fingers on his right hand against the cold metal. The dust settled. The room closed. He stood up straight at the back of the truck. Smoky came around the side of the truck and sat down at his left heel without being called. Her ears were up. Her eyes were on the sheriff. Reeves got out first. Reeves was in his early 60s, tall and lean, with a heavy grey moustache and the face of a man who had been doing his job for 35 years and had stopped being surprised by any of it. He held up one open hand to Jax in a gesture that said easy and not here for trouble in a single motion. Holloway got out of his truck and stood in the lee of his open door with the clipboard in his hand. Holloway did not approach. Reeves walked over alone. Reeves said, "Mr. Harlan." Jax said, "Sheriff." Reeves said, "Don wanted me along this morning." Jax said, "I see that." Reeves said, "He says you have been building a structure that he has concerns about. He says he attempted to issue a stop work order yesterday and you declined to accept it. He has asked me to accompany him to your property this morning, to repeat the issuance and to make a record of the refusal." Jax said, "I'm not at my property this morning." Reeves said, "No, sir, you are not." He looked at the woodshed. He looked at the half-empty truck bed. He looked at Hattie standing on the porch with her arms folded across the wool jacket. He looked back at Jax. "He said you were at Mrs. Brennan's house at 6:45 in the morning in 5 below cold delivering wood." Jax said, "Yes, sir." Reeves said, "Hattie." Hattie said, "Beau." Reeves said, "Is Mr. Harlan here at your invitation?" Hattie said, "He is here at my acceptance of his offer. The propane company has cancelled my delivery until next Wednesday. The forecast says we will not be alive next Wednesday at the rate the temperature is dropping. He brought me wood. He did not charge me for it." Reeves nodded slowly. He turned back to Jax. He said, "Mr. Harlan, may I see your property deed?" Jax went to the cab. He retrieved the deed from the glove compartment. It was in a clear plastic sleeve. He brought it back. He handed it to the sheriff. The sheriff read it. He read all 3 pages. He folded it carefully and handed it back. He said, "Don." Holloway said, "Sheriff." Reeves said, "Come here." Holloway came over. Slowly. Reeves said, "This man's parcel is 40 acres. The 40 acres sits in unincorporated county. Section 7, subsection 4 exempts him from your inspection process." Holloway said, "The discretionary clause." Reeves said, "Don, there is a polar vortex coming down on this valley in 72 hours. I have 1,100 phone calls already this week from people asking what to do. I have a propane company that has stopped delivering. I have a power company that has issued a brownout warning. This man is delivering wood to a 78-year-old widow at 6:45 in the morning. You and I are not going to drive up that ridge and serve him a piece of paper today, are we, Don?" Holloway did not answer. Reeves said, "Are we, Don?" Holloway said, "No." "Sheriff." Reeves said, "Get in the truck." Holloway turned and walked back to his pickup and got in. He did not look at Jax. He did not look at Hattie. He drove away. The pickup's tires kicked up a thin spray of frozen gravel that hung in the cold morning air and did not settle. Reeves stayed. He looked at Jax for a long beat. He said, "Mr. Harlan." "Jax," said Sheriff. Reeves said, "I am sorry he has been at you. Don is a small man who has been given a small office. The office has not improved him." Jax said, "I appreciate that, sir." Reeves said, "I have heard about your structure. I have heard things in this town that I have not believed, and I have heard things that I have believed and have wished I did not." He paused. He said, "If the storm goes the way the weather service is saying it is going to go, this town is in trouble. The grid is rated to 20 below. The forecast is for 50 below. We have a warming center at the high school. We have 1 generator. We do not have enough beds, and we do not have enough capacity for what is coming. I'm telling you this because you are a grown man and a serviceman, and I'm not going to insult you with a speech." Jax said, "No, sir." Reeves said, "If I send people up your ridge during this storm, will you let them in?" Jax did not answer immediately. He looked at the sheriff. He looked at Hattie standing on the porch. He looked at Smoky at his left heel. He thought about the lodge. He thought about the bunk and the hearth and the chimney and the 3 feet of earth. He thought about the man named Daniel Brennan, whose stone foundation he had built his stones on top of. He said yes. Sir. Reeves nodded once. Reeves said, I will not send them unless I have to. I will not advertise it, but if it comes down to it, I will know where to send them. Jax said yes. Sir. Reeves got back in his vehicle. He pulled out. He drove away down the county road. The morning settled. Hattie came down off the porch. She walked across the gravel to where Jax was standing. She did not say anything. She put her hand on his arm just above the elbow briefly, and she squeezed once, and she turned and walked back to the house. Scout came out and sat on the porch and watched the sheriff's truck disappear down the road. Jax stood in the cold gravel drive with Smoky at his heel, and the sky going slowly from dark to lighter grey, and the smoke from the chimney pulling flat to the south. And he understood, for the first time in 11 months, that he was about to be needed. He did not know how to feel about that. He had not been needed in a long time. He had forgotten what it weighed. He drove home. He went to work. By the time the light failed that afternoon, the lodge was finished in every way it could be finished, and the second snow came down in heavy slow flakes at 4:30 in the afternoon, and the temperature was already dropping past 10 below, and the wind out of the north had begun the long deep moaning sound that was the sound of the cold coming, and Smoky lay across the threshold of the lodge that night, and Jax lay on the bunk, and neither of them slept because neither of them needed to. The freeze was in the timber. It would be on the ridge by morning. The thermometer on the lodge porch read -32 when Jax checked it at 5 in the morning on the first full day of the freeze. The needle had dropped 12 degrees in the night, and the brass casing of the gauge had a bloom of frost on it, and the small mercury column inside had gone the colour of wet slate. He stood on the porch in his Arctic parka and looked at it for a long beat without his hand on it. Touching brass at -32 would take skin. He had learned that the hard way once in Alaska on a training rotation in 2010, and he had never had to learn it again. The wind was down. That was the thing about cold this deep. The wind quit because the air got too heavy to move. The air sat in the valleys and the hollows and the low places along the ridges, and it congealed there like something half alive. And the smoke from the lodge chimney did not blow sideways anymore, but rose straight up in a thin grey rope and disappeared into a sky that had no colour at all. The pines on the ridge across the valley were silver blue, and the snow at the base of the lodge was the kind of dry crystal snow that squeaked under a boot like styrofoam. The sun came up at 7:13 and put a flat orange light along the ridge line that did not warm anything. The lodge held 62 degrees inside. He had run a small test fire in the hearth at 3 in the morning when he had gotten up to check the chimney, just enough to take the chill off the stone, and he had banked it down to coals before going back to the bunk. 62. The earth was doing the work the book said the earth would do. The 3 feet of packed dirt at the walls and the 18 inches of sod on the roof, and the stone hearth at the heart of the floor were holding the temperature inside the lodge 94 degrees above the temperature outside. He did the math twice in his head as he stood on the porch with the coffee in his hand. He had not believed it could work. He had built it because the book had said it would work, and because his grandfather had given him the book in 1996 with a look that he was only beginning to understand. He had built it on faith. It was working. He went back inside, he fed Smoky, he ate a bowl of oatmeal and drank a second cup of coffee and listened to the AM radio. The forecaster's voice was tighter than it had been the day before. The grid was experiencing intermittent service in 3 counties. A man had died in Glasgow overnight, an 86-year-old retiree found by a neighbour at his kitchen table with the wood stove cold beside him. 2 warming centres were operational in western Montana. The Iron Hollow Centre was at the high school and was at full capacity. The forecaster said please, twice in a single sentence. Please check on neighbours. Please do not travel. He turned the radio off. He picked up his phone. The cell signal up on the ridge was weak, but it worked when the air was clean. He called Hattie. She picked up on the second ring. He said, "How is the house holding?" She said, 41 degrees in the kitchen. I'm running the stove hot. The wood is going faster than I thought. He said, how much wood is left? She said, 2 days. Maybe 2.5 if I let it drop into the 30s. He said, I will come for you tomorrow morning. She said, Jax. The roads. He said, tomorrow morning. She did not argue. He hung up. He stood in the lodge in the orange light from the kerosene lantern and looked at the door. Smoky was already at the door. Her ears were forward. He spent the day doing the small things. He brought in 3 more days of split wood from the lean-to and stacked it inside the lodge along the back wall. He filled all 4 of his 5-gallon water cans from the spring at the base of the property, and he carried them up the slope and set them inside the door. Water that did not need to be boiled, water that he had drunk for 2 months and never gotten sick from. He cleaned and oiled the small hand pump on the stove. He pulled a second wool blanket out of the duffel and laid it folded at the foot of the bunk. He did not need a second blanket. He laid it for someone else. The day went. The temperature held at -35 through noon and then began to drop again. By 5 in the afternoon it was -41, and the light was nearly gone. He fed Smoky her evening meal. He ate 2 cans of stew from the camp stove. He listened to the radio until the forecaster announced that cell service was failing in 3 counties. He turned the radio off. He sat on the bunk in the lantern light, and he tried to read the small paperback book he had been carrying for 9 months. A worn copy of a Louis L'Amour his grandfather had given him in 1991. He could not focus on the words. He set the book down. Smoky was already up and pacing. She did not pace often. She paced when she did not like a perimeter. She paced when something in the air was wrong. She paced now in slow, small loops between the door and the bunk, and the door, her amber eyes going back and forth across him, her ears moving in a way that was not picking up sound but cataloguing the space in a different language. He watched her for a long minute. He stood up. He said, tonight. Then she stopped at the door. Her tail moved once. He pulled on the parka and the thermal pants and the heavy boots and the wool watch cap and the fleece neck gaiter and a second pair of gloves over the first pair. He took a headlamp. He took the small medical kit out of the duffel. He took the 4-pound emergency sleeping bag rated to -40 out of the crate at the foot of the bunk. He put the bag and the kit in a backpack. He took a small bottle of glucose tablets and a thermos he filled with hot black coffee. He took the keys to the truck. The truck did not start. He stood beside it at the bottom of the access road in the dark with the headlamp on the engine block, and he saw immediately what had happened. The block heater had been running all night, but the cold had won the negotiation with the heater somewhere around -38, and the diesel had gelled in the lines. There was nothing he could do about it tonight. The truck was a brick. The truck would be a brick until the temperature came up by 20 degrees, and the temperature was not coming up by 20 degrees for at least 4 days. He went to the lean-to behind the lodge and he uncovered the snowmobile. The snowmobile was a 2004 Polaris that he had bought used from a man in Idaho for $900 in cash in late September. The man had used it to check fence on a cattle operation. The machine had 8,600 miles on it and a small dent in the right ski and an engine that started on the second pull every time he had tried it. He pulled it out of the lean-to and he pulled the choke and he pulled the cord and the engine fired on the second pull and settled into its hard fast idle in the cold. He warmed it for 3 minutes. He clipped the safety lanyard to his parka. He patted the seat. Smoky jumped up behind him. She braced herself against the small backrest and she put her front paws on his hips for stability, and she pressed her chest into his lower back. She had ridden behind him on 3 machines like this in 3 states. She knew her place. He drove down the access road slow. The headlight cut a single yellow oval through the dark. The cold pressed against the exposed skin of his face above the gaiter, and the wind chill from the machine's own forward motion took the felt temperature down past -60. He turned onto the highway. The highway was empty. There were no plows, there were no cars. The new snow had drifted across the lanes in long tongues a foot deep, and the snowmobile cut through them with the sound of a saw cutting fabric. He drove south for 1.5 miles. He turned east onto the county road. He slowed at the rise. He saw the house. The house was dark. Not just unlit dark. There was no light in the kitchen window. There was no smoke from the chimney. He stopped the snowmobile 30 yards out and killed the engine, and the silence of -41 came down on him like a cloth dropped over his head. He listened. There was nothing. No dog, no sound, no movement. The cold had eaten the sound of the world. He swung off the machine. Smoky was already moving past him. Her body low, her nose up. She crossed the yard at a fast trot and reached the porch and stood at the door and turned her head back to him and waited. He went up the steps. The door was not locked. The door was not even fully latched. He pushed it open. He stepped into the kitchen. The kitchen was 38 degrees. She was sitting at the kitchen table with her back to him. She had on the wool jacket and the heavy scarf and 3 blankets over her shoulders, and her gloved hands were wrapped around an enamel mug that she had set down on the table some time ago. And Scout was curled in her lap inside the blankets, his small body pressed up under her chin. The wood stove behind her was cold. There were perhaps 6 small splits in the wood box beside it. The propane heater in the corner had stopped at some point in the night. The window above the sink was completely iced over. Her breath was rising visible in the air in front of her in slow, weak puffs. He said her name. She turned her head slowly. Her eyes were open. They focused on him. She said Jax. He said Hattie. How long has the stove been out? She said, I do not know. Maybe an hour. Maybe 2. I lost track. He said, can you stand? She said yes. Slowly. He said, we are going. He moved fast. He went to her. He helped her up from the chair. She was lighter than he had remembered, like a frame of birds inside the wool jacket. He wrapped the 4-pound emergency bag around her shoulders over the blankets. He sat her back down at the table. He took Scout from her lap. The old beagle was warm but slow, and his eyes had gone milky with the cold. He put Scout inside the front of his own parka against the heat of his own chest, and he zipped the parka up to his chin. The dog did not protest. The dog made one small sound that was not quite a whine and not quite a sigh, and he settled against Jax's sternum and went still. He helped Hattie back up. He walked her to the door. Smoky walked at her other side, leaning lightly against her hip, taking some of the weight without being asked. He sat Hattie on the porch. He went back into the kitchen. He banked the few coals in the wood stove. He turned the propane off at the tank outside the kitchen window because if it came back on while she was gone, the line could rupture at this temperature. He locked the door behind him. He got Hattie onto the snowmobile. He sat her sideways in front of him in his lap, with her body across his thighs and her back against his chest, and the emergency bag and blankets wrapped tight around her. He put her gloved hands inside his parka against the warmth of Scout. He tucked his own gaiter up over her face. Smoky took her position behind him. He started the machine. He turned it back toward home. The ride was 1.5 miles. The first half-mile was straight road and clean air, and he made it in 2 minutes. On the second half-mile, where the county road turned north into the timber to meet the highway, he had to slow the machine down to a crawl because the drifts were 3 feet deep across the road, and the snowmobile would not climb them at speed. He worked through the drifts in low gear, the engine groaning, the headlight bouncing yellow off the white. Smoky's chest was pressed hard against his back. Hattie's head was tucked against the side of his throat, and he could feel her breath warm and shallow against the skin above his collarbone. A tree limb broke somewhere up in the timber on his left. The crack was clean and sharp and very loud. It was the sound of 2 pounds of ice load finally winning a long argument with a piece of green pine, and the limb came down out of a tree maybe 40 yards in from the road and hit the snow with a soft, heavy thump. He heard the crack. His body heard the crack. His body did not hear a tree limb. His body heard the report of a 7.62 round leaving the muzzle of a Dragunov rifle from the second floor of a compound in Sangin province at 0540 in the morning of June 18, 2014. The round that took Specialist Antonio Dunn through the side of the neck just above the plate of his vest while he was kneeling beside Jax in the alley with his radio handset to his ear. The room in his brain came open all the way. The dust came up across the inside of his eyes, and the dust was the dust of an Afghan compound, and the temperature inside his head was 104 degrees. And the radio was blowing static, and Dunn was going down on his right side, and his hand was reaching for Dunnett's gear, and his body was already moving in two directions at once, one toward the threat and one toward the man on the ground. The snowmobile S engine became the engine of Unwrap idling at the end of the alley. The cold in his face became the heat of full kit at 0540. The white of the road in front of him became the brown of the dust against the breaching wall. He was going to crash the snowmobile. He felt the throttle hand losing pressure. He felt the machine slowing. He felt his vision narrowing. He felt his breath stopping. He felt the woman in his lap slipping toward the edge of his consciousness. Smoky's muzzle came up over his right shoulder from behind him and pressed against the side of his neck below his ear. The pressure was firm and warm and absolute. She did not lick, she did not whine, she did not move. She put her muzzle against the carotid artery on the right side of his neck, and she pushed it there, and she held it there with the steady weight of her. And the smell of her, the smell of dog and pine, and the small blood-warm smell that he had known for 9 years through 3 deployments and 1 divorce and 11 months of sleeping in a truck, came up around the inside of his collar, and his body received the smell. And his body knew that smell, and his body said you are not in Sangin before his mind could catch up and say it for him. He counted 4 pines on the ridge on his left. He counted 4 trees on the ridge on his right. He counted 4 fingers on his right hand against the throttle grip. He counted 4 breaths in. He counted 4 breaths out. The room in his brain closed. The dust settled out of his eyes. The road came back. The cold came back. The weight of the woman in his lap came back. The weight of the dog inside his parka came back. The weight of Smoky pressed against the side of his neck came back. He breathed in all the way down to the bottom of his lungs, and he breathed out, and he reached up Vekepte his right hand, and he laid it briefly against the side of Smoky's face. She held the pressure for 1 count. Then she lowered her muzzle from his neck, and she set her chin on his right shoulder, and she stayed there. He opened the throttle. The machine moved forward. The drift parted. They came up onto the highway. He drove the last 1.5 miles on instinct. He turned onto his access road. He climbed the slope. He pulled the snowmobile up to the porch of the lodge. He killed the engine. The silence of -41 came down on the 3 of them, but there was light in the lodge windows. The orange of the kerosene lantern. The promise of 62 degrees inside walls that could not be touched by what was outside. He carried Hattie inside. He laid her on the bunk. He took Scout out of his parka, and he laid the old dog beside her under the wool blanket. He stoked the small fire in the hearth. He boiled water. He made hot broth from a packet. He put a thermometer under her tongue, 94.8. Mild hypothermia, survivable. He had treated worse a dozen times. He worked methodically. He warmed her core first with the broth and the wool and the heat of the lodge. He did not warm her hands or feet too fast. He sat Vekepte on the bunk, and he held the mug for her so she could drink slowly. Smoky lay on the floor at the side of the bunk with her chin on her front paws and her amber eyes on the wool. After a long time Hattie's colour came back. She looked around the lodge. She looked at the stone hearth. She looked at the timber rafters. She looked at the small windows. She looked at the dirt floor laid with flagstone. She looked at the kerosene lantern, and the bunk and the wool blanket, and the small wood stove, and the old man's dog she had pulled out of the cold, and the man who had pulled. She said, Dan dreamed of this. He did not say anything. She closed her eyes. She slept. He sat on the small folding camp chair beside the bunk for the rest of the night. He did not sleep. The lodge held 62 degrees. Outside, the air sank past -45. Smoky lay between him and the door with one ear up. The cold had found the valley. The cold had come for the old woman and the old dog. It had not gotten. He had not let it. The thermometer on the porch read -52 when the morning of the 4th day came up over Bramble Ridge in a grey light that had no warmth in it whatsoever. Jax had been awake for all of the night and most of the night before that, and his eyes had gone the dry sea feel that they used to go on the 3rd day of a long mission. But his hands were steady and his breathing was slow, and the lodge around him held 61 degrees on the small dial thermometer he had nailed above the and the old woman on the bunk had slept 7 hours straight, and her colour was back, and the old dog beside her had eaten a small bowl of warm rice and broth at 6 in the morning and was sleeping again. And he was sitting at the small pine table in the corner of the lodge with a mug of coffee in his hand, watching the light come up through the southeast windows, and the cold outside was a thing that could not get in. The fire in the hearth had not been fed since 2 in the morning. It was a low bed of coals now, and it would not need a fresh log for another 4 hours. The earth in the walls was doing the work. He had calculated it twice the night before, sitting at this same table with a stub of pencil and a sheet of grocery sack paper. The thermal mass of the packed walls and the sod roof had absorbed enough heat over the previous 6 weeks of low background fires that the structure was running on stored heat now. The fire was supplemental. The fire was, in this cold, almost decorative. He had not believed the book when he had read it. He believed it now. Hattie woke at 7. She moved slowly under the wool blanket. She sat up. He brought her a mug of coffee kept milk powder and sugar stirred into it the way she had taken hers in her own kitchen. She drank it without speaking. Scout shifted in his sleep against her hip. Smoky lifted her head from the floor and watched the woman. The dog and the woman exchanged a look that was older than the morning, a look that said, "We are here, we are still here," and Hattie put her hand briefly on top of Smoky's head, and Smoky leaned into the hand the way a horse leans into a brush. Hattie said, "Mot ve kepanerta to tell you about him?" He yes. Ma'am. She did not start right away. She drank her coffee. She watched the orange light come slowly up the wall opposite the southeast windows. She held the mug in both hands. After a long minute she set the mug down and folded her hands in her lap, and she began. She said, "Daniel Brennan was born in Bozeman in Mortninchin-bon-Muy. He was the youngest of 4 brothers. The other 3 were too old for Vietnam and too young for Korea. He drew the war. He enlisted in Mortninchin-Somilam because he did not want to be drafted into the regular infantry. He went to long-range reconnaissance. He was good at it. He served 2 tours. The first one was Mortninchin-Somi-Bait to Mortninchin-Somi-Tam. The second one was Mortninchin-Somi-Chin to Mortninchin-Cham-Bay-Mi. He came home in March of Mortninchin-Cham-Bay-Mi-Mort, and we were married in November of that year. Mort had known him since we were 15. We had been writing letters for 6 years. Mort had not seen him in 4. He was 29 years old when he came back. He was not the boy Mort had said goodbye to. He was a man who had lived inside a kind of fear that does not leave a person, and he was also still the boy who had taught me to ride a horse on his father's ranch when Mott was 16, and the 2 of them lived in him at the same time, and they did not always agree. She paused. He waited. She said, "He could not stand close walls. He could not sleep in our bedroom. He slept on the porch through the spring and summer of Bay-Mi Mort, and he slept in a wall tent in the side yard from November to March. Mott went out to the tent every night with a thermos of coffee and a wool blanket, and Mott sat with him until he fell asleep. He talked to me sometimes. Most nights he did not. Mott learned not to mind the silence. Mott learned that his silence was not absence. It was what was left of him after the war had taken what it took." She drank more coffee. She said, "In the spring of Mortninchin-Bay-Mi-Hai, he found that 40 acres on the ridge. He bought it with combat pay. He came home that day, and he sat at our kitchen table, and he showed me a magazine article about a man in New Mexico who was building a house into a hillside. He said, 'Mott, I'm going to build us a house like this.' I said, 'All right.' He said, 'It will take me 10 years.' Mott said, 'All right, the town will think Mott am crazy.' Mott said, 'They already do.' He looked at Mott fee me for a long time. He laughed. He had not laughed in 14 months. Mott cried. He did not see me cry." She paused again. The light in the lodge had shifted up the wall. She said, "He read for 3 years. He bought every book he could find on earth shelters and earth contact and thermal mass. He drove to Colorado twice to look at structures that had been built. He drove to New Mexico once. He sat at our kitchen table at Motf night and drew plans on yellow legal paper. He started building in the spring of Mortninchin-Bay-Mi-Lam. He worked alone. He worked weekends and evenings. He worked when he was not at the mill, which was where he was earning his living. He did not ask anyone for help. The town began to mock him in the 2nd year. They called him the gopher. They said he was building a hole. They said the war had broken him and he was going to live underground because he could not live on top of it like a man. He did not care. Mort cared. Mort cared so much it tore me up some weeks. He told me one night in the fall of Mortninchin-Bay-Mi Bay to stop caring. He said, "Hat, They are not building this. Mort AM, he said, let them say what they want. The cold does not care what they call us, only what we built. She stopped. Her eyes filled. She did not let it go further. She set the mug down. She placed her hands flat on the small pine table. She said, he died on October Muribone Morchin Tammi Mort. He was 41 years old. He had the foundation in. He had the walls up. He had the roof timbers in. He had not put the sod on. He died on a Wednesday afternoon in the timber, on his way back from the lodge to his truck. His heart stopped. The doctor said it was a congenital defect that had not shown up in any examination. Mort Canoe Vekep, it was the war. They had given him things over there in the second tour. Pills, shots. He had told me about it when he was very tired one night. Mote have spent 45 years certain it was the war and unable to prove. She lifted her hands off the table and put them back in her lap. She said, Mort never went back up to the lodge after the funeral. Mort could not. The land sat for 33 years. Mort could not bring myself to sell it. Mort could not bring myself to walk it. In Heim my bone a man came to me and offered me $90,000 for the 40 acres, and Mott told him no, and Mott did not give him a reason. In August of this year you walked into the post office, and you carried my magazines to my truck without saying a word. Mott watched you walk. Mort watched the way you held your shoulders. Mort watched the dog wait for you in the bed of the truck without barking at me. Mort watched you tip your cap. Mott went home, and Mott sat at my kitchen table, and Mott cried for 2 hours, and at the end of the 2 hours Mott drove to the gas station, and Mott waited until you came in for diesel, and Mott gave you my address, and Mott told you Mott had land you should look at, and Mott drove home. She paused for a long beat. She said, Mort did not sell you the land for the money, Jax. Mort sold it to you because the dog walked the property line the way Dan S. old dog used to walk it. Major, he was a German Shepherd too. Dan had brought him back from a working line in California in Morchin Bay South. He died 11 months after Dan did, in his sleep, on the rug in front of our wood stove. He had been waiting for Dan to come home. When he understood Dan was not coming home, he stopped eating, and then he stopped breathing, and that was that. She reached into the inside pocket of the wool jacket. She pulled out a small flat envelope, yellowed with age, sealed with a strip of tape that had darkened to the colour of bourbon. She laid it on the table. She slid it across the wood toward him. She said, he wrote this in Mortin Tarmin. It is for you. He did not know your name. He knew there would be a man. He picked up the envelope. He held it in his hands. He did not open it yet. Hattie reached into her other pocket. She set a brass key on the table beside the envelope. She said, that is the key to the steel locker in my barn. His tools are in it. His journals. The plans he drew on the yellow legal paper. The letters he wrote to his commanding officer that he never sent. The letters his commanding officer wrote back to him that he did keep. They are yours. All of it. Jax looked at the envelope. He looked at the key. He looked at the woman across the table. He said, Hattie. She said, Mort cannot read the letter to you. He wrote it for the man who would come. Mort am not the man who came. You are. He nodded. He set the envelope down. He set the key down. He put his hands flat on the table the way she had put hers. He breathed in. He breathed out. The dam in his chest did not break the way dams break in stories. It did not flood. It did not roar. It made a small, low sound somewhere deep inside the structure of him, the sound of a single old beam shifting after 50 years of holding too much weight, and a fine line of water began to seep out from underneath, and he closed his eyes and let it seep. And he did not wipe his face when the seep reached his cheek, and he did not look away from the table. Smoky rose up off the floor. She came across the lodge to the table. She did not sit beside him. She lay down across his boots, her body pressed lengthwise against the tops of both his feet, her chin on the floor between them, and her weight settled onto him the way her weight had settled onto him 1,000 times in 1,000 places, and she did not move for a long time, and neither did he. After a long time he opened his eyes. He picked up the envelope. He broke the seal. He unfolded the single sheet of yellow paper inside. The handwriting was firm and angled and unhurried. The ink was black. The paper had yellowed, but the ink had held. The letter read, "To the man who finishes this. If you are reading this, you have built on my foundation. That means you walked the land, and you saw what Mott saw, and you thought what Mott thought, and you went and got rocks, and you put them where Mott put mine. Mott do not know your name. Mott do not need to. Mott know what you are. You came home from a war, and the war did not leave you, and you found that the world you came back to did not have a place inside it where you could fit, and so you went and you started building a place. That is who you are. That is who Mott am. That is who Hat will give this letter to. Mott am not going to tell you how to build it. You already know. The book will help. The earth will help. The dog will tell you when something is wrong before you know it yourself. Listen to the dog. The dog is the only one of us who came back from any war the same as we were when we left. Listen to me on this one thing only. The town will mock you. They mocked me. They will mock you. Do not waste yourself on them. The cold does not care what they call us, only what we built. When the cold comes, and it will come, and it will be worse than any cold you have ever lived through, you open the door. You let them in. You do not say anything about what they called you. You let them in. That is the work. The shelter is not for you. The shelter was never for you. The shelter is for whoever needs it when the cold comes. Build it well. Hat will know what to do with this letter when she sees you. She has waited for you a long time. So have Mott. Daniel Brown, October Mortninchen. He read the letter twice. He folded it. He laid it on the table beside the brass key. He said, Hattie. She said, Motkano Vakep. He said he knew there would be a man. She said he knew. He always knew. They sat for a while in the lodge in the orange light from the southeast windows, and they did not speak. Smoky lay across his boots. Scout slept on the bunk under the wool blanket. The lodge held 61 degrees. Outside, the air sat heavy in the valley at -52 degrees and did not move. The first knock on the door came at 9:14. It was a small knock, 3 quick taps from the back of a gloved hand that had no strength left in it. Smoky was up off Jax's boots and at the door before Jax had registered the sound. Her ears were forward, but her hackles were not up, and her tail was steady. She had read the knock as not threat. He stood up from the table, he went to the door, he opened it. Marcus Tate stood on the porch. The boy was 19 years old and tall and lean, and right now he was something else. His face was raw red at the cheeks, and his eyebrows were white with frost, and his lips were the colour of pavement, and he was breathing in the small, rapid way that a person breathes when their body has been working at the edge of what their body can do for a long time. He had come up the access road on a snowmobile he had borrowed from his uncle. The snowmobile sat at the bottom of the slope, still ticking from the cold. He had pulled himself the last 100 yards up the slope on foot because the engine had cut out before he could get up the ground. His snow pants were caked solid with ice from the knees down. He said, Harlan. Jack said, Marcus. Marcus said, Sir, the sheriff said. He said, If it got bad. He said, You would. Jack stepped back from the door. He said, Inside. Now. Marcus came in. Jax closed the door behind him. He sat the boy down on the camp chair beside the hearth. He put a wool blanket around his shoulders. He poured him a mug of hot broth. The boy drank it in long pulls. His hands shook. He breathed. His colour came up. After 3 minutes he could speak in full sentences. He said, My mum, my grandmother, my little sister. The trailer lost heat last night. The propane tank froze. We tried to make it on the kerosene heater. The kerosene ran out at 4 this morning. We went to the school. The school is full. They are turning people away. The sheriff was at the door. He saw me. He came over. He said, Go to Bramble Ridge. He said, The man up there. He said, Sir, please. Jack said, How many? Marcus said, 4. My mom Tasha. My grandmother Wilma. She is 82. My sister Lila. She is 8. And my uncle Ray. He has the snowmobile. He stayed back to help my grandmother on the trip. They are at the bottom of the access road. Mort came up first to ask. Jack said, Get them. Marcus said, Sir. Mort do not have the strength to. Jack said, Mort will go down with you. We will bring them up. Now. He pulled on the parka. He looked at Hattie. She nodded. She had already moved Scout off the bunk and was rolling the wool blanket into a tighter shape so that there would be room for an old woman on the bunk beside her. Smoky was at the door. He nodded at her once. He said, "With me." He went down the slope with Marcus and Smoky. The slope was a quarter-mile of packed snow and frozen gravel, and at -52 it was the kind of slope that could kill a man whose lungs were not used to working in air that thick. He took it slow. They reached the bottom. Ray Tate was a man in his late 30s with a heavy beard and frost on it. His mother was on the back of the snowmobile wrapped in a sleeping bag and 3 coats. Tasha was beside the machine with her arm around an 8-year-old girl whose face was buried in her Mother S coat. Lila Tate, 8 years old, pink coat. Jax did not waste time. He took Wilma off the snowmobile and into his own arms. The old woman weighed perhaps 100 pounds. He carried her up the slope at a steady pace, and Marcus took his sister by the hand and walked her up, and Tasha and Ray walked behind them, and Smoky walked beside Jax Verkepte at her shoulder, leaning against the side of his thigh because the snow was deep and the load was awkward and she was steadying him. They reached the lodge in 11 minutes. He carried Wilma straight to the bunk. He laid her beside Hattie. Hattie wrapped her in the wool blanket. The 2 old women looked at each other across the bunk in the lantern light, and they both began to weep without sound. He treated them. Wilma's core temperature was 93.1, Tasha S was 95 flat, Lila was 96 and shivering hard. Ray and Marcus were still in the safe zone. He moved through them in the order of priority, the way he had moved through casualties in country, and the way he had moved through training drills at Walter Reed, and the lodge held its 61 degrees, and the bodies in it began to thaw. At 10:42 the second knock came. This time it was Pastor Eli Marsden, who ran the small Methodist church on the corner of 2nd and Birch, and who had baptized Marcus Tate in Mochinchimisau and married Tasha and her husband in Highcombe High, and had buried that same husband in Highcombe My Bourne after a logging accident. The pastor was 67 years old, white-haired, gentle and apolitical, in a way that had made him invisible to the loud people in town for 30 years. He had a Kubota tractor with a heated cab. He had been driving it through the streets of Iron Hollow since 6 in the morning, picking up people whose homes had failed and whose calls to the warming centre were not being answered. He had 4 people on the back of the tractor. A man named Carl, who was 61 and a retired millwright. A woman named Ginny, who was 42 and had a 5-year-old boy named Cody. A man named Jed Dolan, who was a quiet rancher who lived on the far side of the ridge. The pastor said, "Jax, Mottam sorry. The school cannot take any more." The sheriff said. Jax said, "Inside." Eli. "All of you." He took them in. The lodge had now 12 people inside it, plus the 2 dogs. 12 people. 2 dogs. A stone hearth. A small fire that he fed 1 fresh log every 2 hours, and 3 feet of packed earth at the walls. The lodge held 61 degrees. The third knock came at 12:06 in the afternoon. It was a different kind of knock. It was a hard knock. A man-s knock. 3 slow, heavy thumps from the side of a fist that had been holding itself closed for a long time. Smoky was at the door. Her ears were forward. Her tail did not move. He looked at her for a long beat, and she looked back at him, and there was something in her amber eyes that he could not read except to understand that she had decided this knock was not threat either, but it was something else, and the something else was hard. He opened the door. Wendell Crane stood on the porch. He was 62 years old and tall and stooped, and he looked like a man who had aged 10 years in a single morning. The tip of his nose was white with the beginnings of frostbite. His lips were blue. His hands were bare. His ears were uncovered. He had on a hunting jacket that was not warm enough for any temperature below 10 degrees. Behind him on the steps stood his 2 grown sons, Cole and Garrett, both in their late 30s, both shaking. Behind them, leaning against the porch rail because she could not stand on her own, was a small woman in a plaid coat, Doris Crane, Wendell-s wife. She was 60 years old and she had moderate emphysema, and she was breathing in the small, fast-catching way that a person with damaged lungs breathes when they have been outside for too long in cold this hard. Wendell took off his hat. His knuckles were the colour of slate. He held the hat against his chest with both hands. He looked at Mutfer Jax and his eyes filled and he did not let it go further. He said, "Mr. Harlan," Jax said. "Crane," Wendell said. "Our heat went out at 3 this morning. The backup generator failed at 6. Mort drove my wife to the school. They turned us away. They said Pastor Marsden had taken some folks up to your place. They said you were taking people in. Mort know what Mort said about your place. Mott said it loud, and Mott said it for 2 months. I should not have. Mott am asking. He could not finish. He stood on the porch with the hat in his hands and his eyes wet, and he could not finish. Jax did not say anything. He stepped back from the door. He opened it the rest of the way. Smoky stepped to the side. Wendell came in. The 2 sons came in. Doris was the last one. She came in slowly, one hand on the doorframe, her chest rising and falling in the small, fast pattern that was her body fighting for air. It could not get out of cold, this thing. She made it 3 steps into the lodge, her knees buckled. She slid down the inside wall and she sat hard on the flagstone with her back against the cool, packed earth and her hands clutching at the front of her coat over her sternum. And her breathing went from fast to small to a sound that was almost not breathing at all. A wet, thin pull, a whistle at the end of it. Wendell said, "Doris." He went down on his knees in front of her. He took her hands. Her eyes were open. They were focused on his face. Her chest was working hard. The whistle was getting tighter. Smoky moved. She had been sitting beside Jax at the door. She crossed the lodge floor in a slow, steady walk that took her past the bunk where Hattie and Wilma were lying, past the camp chair where Lila Tate was sitting on Marcus, past Ray and Tasha and Pastor Marsden and Carl and Ginny and Jed Dolan and the 5-year-old Cody who was eating a piece of bread, and she did not look at any of them. She did not stop for any of them. She walked across the lodge in a straight line, and she stopped in front of Doris Crane sliding down the wall, and she lowered her body to the flagstone in front of the woman, and she sat on her haunches, and she lifted her head, and she laid her muzzle into the woman's lap on top of the woman's clutched hands. She did not move. She did not whine, she did not press, she did not nudge. She set her muzzle down across the back of the woman's hands, as if her muzzle had always belonged, as if the position were a thing she had practiced for 9 years across 3 deployments and 1 divorce and 11 months of sleeping in a truck, and 3 months of building a lodge out of dirt. And she held the position with the absolute steadiness of a working dog who has been given a job. The lodge went quiet. 12 people stopped speaking. The pastor stopped halfway through a sentence. Marcus stopped pouring broth. Hattie looked across the room from the bunk and her hand went up to her mouth. Doris Crane looked down at the dog. She did not say anything. Her chest, which had been working in the small fast-catching pattern, slowed. Her ribs lifted in a longer, steadier rise. Her shoulders dropped from up by her ears down to where shoulders are supposed to sit. Her hands, which had been clutching the front of her coat, opened slowly and came to rest on top of the dog's head. Her fingers moved through the thick double coat at the base of the dog's ears in the absent, patient way that women in the West have stroked the heads of working dogs since there were women in the West and there were dogs to stroke. The whistle in her chest went away. Her breathing came back. It came back slow and full. It came back the way a tide comes back. It came back because the warm, steady weight of a dog who had decided that this woman in this room at this moment was the woman who needed her had transferred itself from the dog S-body into the woman S-body, and the woman S-body had received it, and the woman's body had remembered that it knew how to breathe. Smoky did not move. Wendell Crane was on his knees in front of his wife, with his hands wrapped around her hands now on top of the dog's head, and his face was wet, and his shoulders were shaking. He was not making a sound. He was looking at Motfi, his wife, and he was looking at the dog, and he was looking at the man standing across the lodge by the door, and he could not stop the tears, and he was not trying. He looked up at Jax. He said. Jax shook his head once. Slowly. Not no. Not yes. Just enough. Wendell closed his mouth. He nodded. He pressed his forehead to his wife's hands on top of the dog's head, and he stayed there. Jax turned away from the scene. He walked back to the small pine table in the corner of the lodge. He sat down. He put his hands flat on the wood. Hattie was watching him from the bunk. He did not look at her. He could not just then. He put his palms down flat against the rough pine, and he breathed in slowly for 4 counts, and he breathed out slowly for 4 counts, and the small thin line of water that had begun to seep from the place inside him that morning, when he had read Daniel S. letter, was seeping faster. And it was not going to stop today, and that was all right, because the lodge was warm, and there were 12 people in it, and a working dog who had spent her last 5 years guarding the perimeter of one broken man was sitting across the room with her muzzle in another woman's lap, doing the work she had been put on this earth to do. After a long time he stood up. He walked over to where Wendell still knelt. He laid his hand briefly on Wendell S.'s shoulder. He did not speak. He turned and walked to the bunk. He laid his hand briefly on Hattie S.'s shoulder. He did not speak. He went back to the door and sat down on the camp chair beside it, and Smoky's empty space was still warm beside him on the flagstone, and he sat there and watched 12 people and one dog learn how to breathe again at 61 degrees inside the lodge that an old soldier had started 45 years ago, and another old soldier had finished without ever knowing he was finished. Hattie said, from the bunk, in a voice that did not carry past the table, Dan would have done this. Jack said, in a voice that did not carry past the bunk, he showed me how. He just did not know it. She nodded. She closed her eyes. She slept. The fire in the hearth ate one more log. The lodge held 61. The cold outside had no entrance. The 5th day of the freeze began at 3:47 in the morning, when Doris Crane's breathing changed again. Jax had not slept. He had been at the small pine table in the corner of the lodge for 36 hours by then, sitting in the kerosene light with his coffee in his hand, watching 12 people sleep in a single room that was holding 61 degrees on the dial thermometer above the. Hattie was on the bunk with Wilma Tate beside her, the 2 old women curled toward a Gehat, other under the wool blanket, like 2 cats who had decided they had always known each other. Lila Tate was on the floor at the foot of the bunk in the 4-pound emergency sleeping bag, her small head on Smoky's flank, the dog's amber eyes half open and tracking the door. Ginny and her 5-year-old Cody were in the camp chair turned sideways, Vey Kephut, both of them tucked into a single sleeping bag. Carl the millwright was on the flagstone against the south wall with his head on his folded coat. Jed Dolan the rancher was in the corner by the woodbox with his hat over his face. Ray Tate and Marcus Tate were against the east wall side by side. Pastor Marsden was at the door across from Smoky, sitting up against the wall, his lips moving in something that might have been prayer and might have been a list of names. Wendell Crane was on the floor beside Doris. He had been there since the moment he had come through the door. He had not slept either. He had laid his coat over her and his hat over her hands, and he had stayed on the flagstone with his back against the wall and his shoulder against her shoulder, and every 20 minutes for the past 16 hours he had laid the back of his hand against her cheek and watched her. At 3:47 in the morning her breathing changed. It was not loud, it was a small adjustment, the depth went out of it, the pull at the bottom of each inhalation shortened, the whistle at the end of each exhalation came back. Wendell saw it before Jax did because he was 3 feet from her face, and he had been watching her for 16 hours, and he had been married to her for 38 years, and he knew the sound of her lungs the way a man knows the sound of his own truck. He looked across the lodge at Jax. Jax was already standing. He crossed the room. He went down on one knee beside Doris. He laid the back of his fingers against her forehead. He laid them against her throat. He counted the rise and fall of her ribs over 30 seconds. Her respiration was 28 per minute. It had been 16 at midnight. Her pulse was rapid and thready. Her colour in the kerosene light had moved from the soft pink it had been the evening before to the grey that was the colour of trouble. He said, quietly, so he would not wake the other 10, she needs oxygen. Wendell said, Motkano Vekep. Jack said, she has emphysema. Wendell said, yes. Stage 3. She has been on a concentrator for 2 years. The concentrator died with the power. Jack said, where would there be a tank? Wendell said, the clinic. The Iron Hollow Clinic on 2nd Street. They keep portable oxygen for ambulance transfers. There are usually 2 or 3 tanks in the back room. There are also concentrators that run off battery for short trips. Jack said, can you get there? Wendell said. Not alone. The roads are gone. Jax said, on a snowmobile. Wendell said, Mott have not ridden a snowmobile in 15 years. Jax said, Mott will go. Wendell looked at him. Wendell said, it is my wife. Jax said, Mott kan överke. Wendell said, Mott should go. Jax said, you will go with me. We will take both machines. Mine and your son S. It is a 4-mile run. It is minus 51 degrees. We will go now. Wendell looked at him for a long beat in the kerosene light. He nodded. He woke Cole and Garrett. He told them quietly what was happening. He told Cole, stay with your mother. He told Garrett, your machine is on the porch. Bring it around to the front. The two sons moved without speaking. Wendell pulled on his boots. Jax pulled on the parka and the thermal pants and the heavy boots and the gaiter and the watch cap and the gloves over the gloves. He took the small medical kit from the duffel. He took 2 more sleeping bags. He took the 4 remaining glucose packets from the crate. He took the keys to his snowmobile. Smoky was at the door. She was standing. Her ears were forward. He looked at her. She looked at him. He said, quietly, you stay. With Hattie. With Lila. She lowered her ears. She did not protest. She took 2 steps backward and lay down beside Lila Tate on the flagstone again. The little girl moved in her sleep and put her hand on the dog's flank without waking. Smoky put her chin on her front paws and watched him go. Hattie was awake on the bunk. She had not made a sound, but she was watching him over Wilma's shoulder. He did not say anything. She nodded once. He nodded back. He went out into the dark with Wendell Crane behind him. The cold at 3:47 on the morning of the 5th day was the cold of stories. It was the cold that did not feel like cold. It epelerte like absence, like the air had decided it was not going to be there anymore. The pines on the ridge across the valley made a small, high cracking sound every few minutes as the sap inside them froze and split the wood at the heart. The stars were closer than they had any right to be. The sky was the colour of a deep well at the bottom of which there was a coin. He started his snowmobile on the second pull. Cole had Garrett's machine running already. Garrett mounted up. Wendell climbed onto the back of his son's machine. Jax took the lead. He turned south down the access road. The 4 miles into Iron Hollow took them 48 minutes. He chose the route carefully. He kept to the highway because the ditches were drifted 10 feet deep and the timber was full of widowmakers waiting to come down. He went slow. He kept his headlight on the snow 10 feet in front of his ski. He listened for the cracking of pines on the ridges, and he counted them, and he kept his hand steady on the throttle. The room in his brain stayed closed. Smoky was 3 miles behind him on the flagstone with a sleeping 8-year-old S-hand on her flank. He did not need her on the back of the machine tonight. He had her presence inside him from the day before. He carried it in. The town of Iron Hollow at 4:30 in the morning of the 5th day of the freeze was a town that had ceased. The streetlights were dark. The houses on Main Street were dark. The only light in any window in any building on the 4 blocks of downtown was the orange flicker of a single kerosene lantern in the front window of the sheriff's office. He pulled up in front of the clinic. The clinic was the small brick building on the corner of 2nd and Cherry that had been the town doctor's office for 40 years and had been converted into a clinic in Hein Kong Tam when the town doctor had finally retired and a younger nurse practitioner had bought the practice. The building was dark. The front door was locked. He walked across the street to the sheriff's office. He knocked on the door. Bo Reeves opened the door. He was in his uniform. He had not slept. He had a cup of coffee in his left hand and a flashlight in his right. He looked at Jax in the cold dark. He looked at Wendell Crane behind him. He did not say anything for a long beat. He said, "Harlan," Jax said. "Sheriff. We need into the clinic. Mrs. Crane needs oxygen." Reeves said, "How many in your lodge?" Jax said, 12. "And 2 dogs." Reeves said, "Alive." Jax said, "All of them." Reeves was quiet for one long beat. Then he reached behind the door and took down a heavy ring of keys from a hook. He pulled on his coat, he came out onto the sidewalk, and he locked the office behind him. He walked across the street to the clinic with Jax and Wendell behind him, and he opened the door with the third key on the ring, and he led them through the dark waiting room into the back, and he opened the storage cabinet, and there were 3 portable oxygen tanks on the and there were 2 battery-powered concentrators in their cases below the tanks, and the nurse practitioner had left a note taped to the inside of the cabinet door that said, "Whoever needs these, take them, Mott trust you." Reeves loaded them into a duffel. He did not speak. He carried the duffel out himself. He set it across the hood of Jax' snowmobile and he tied it down with paracord he produced from his pocket. He stood up. He looked at Jax. He said, "Mr. Harlan." Jax said, "Sheriff." Reeves said, "Mott am going to come up there at the end of this. Mott am going to come up there, and Mott am going to look at what you have built, and Mott am going to apologize for not coming up there sooner." Jax said, "You owe no apology." Reeves said, "Mott do." Jax said, "No, sir." Reeves said, "Get back to her." Jax mounted up. Wendell mounted up behind Garrett. They turned the machines around. They headed north out of town. The ride back was longer. It was longer because Garrett's snowmobile failed at the 2-mile mark. The engine was an older Haikong-Hai Yamaha that had not been treated kindly in its life and had been pushed harder than its life had ever asked it to be. And somewhere on the long straight stretch where the highway crossed the small frozen creek beside the closed BP station, the engine made a small dry sound and then a smaller dry sound, and then it did not make any sound at all. Garrett coasted to a stop at the side of the road. He pulled the choke, he pulled the cord. The engine did not catch. He pulled it again, it did not catch. He pulled it 8 more times, it did not catch. Wendell sat behind him on the dead machine in the dark on the side of the highway at -51 degrees with a duffel of oxygen tanks roped to Jax's machine 50 yards ahead, and his wife 3 miles away in a lodge with her chest tightening, and he understood, in a single clear moment, that they were not going to make it. Jax stopped. He turned his machine. He pulled it back to where Wendell and Garrett were sitting. He killed his engine. He got off. He looked at the dead Yamaha. He laid his hand on the engine block. He shook his head once. He said, "Diesel gel. Carb iced. Mort cannot fix it here." Wendell said, "Jax." Jax said, "Wait." He stood for a long beat in the dark with his hand on the dead machine and his breath rising in slow plumes against the headlight of his own snowmobile. And his mind ran through the geography of the last 3 days, and the brass key on the small pine table back at the lodge, and the words Hattie had said that morning at the kitchen table, and the steel locker in her barn that he had not yet opened. And he came back from the calculation with a thing he had not had before. He said, "Hattie's barn." Wendell said, "What?" Jax said, "Daniel had a snowcat, she told me yesterday morning. It is in the steel locker barn. It has been parked since Mortninchin Tammi Mort. He had it stored properly. The keys are on the same ring as the key to the locker. It is 2 miles back to her place from my access road. Mort can get there in 20 minutes. If the engine starts, Mott can be back at the lodge in another 15. Mott can come down here in another 15. We can have your wife on oxygen by 6 in the morning." Wendell said, "That is Jax, a snowcat that has been parked since." Jax said, "Daniel built it the way he built the lodge. He built things to last." Garrett said, "Dad." Wendell looked at his son. He looked at Jax. He said, "Go." Jax mounted up. He took the duffel of oxygen with him because he could not leave it by the dead machine in the cold. He turned the snowmobile back north. He opened the throttle. He rode. He reached the access road at 4:58. He continued past it. He turned onto the county road. He rode the 2 miles to Hattie's place. He pulled up to the barn. He killed the engine. He took the brass key out of his inside pocket, the key she had laid on the table that morning, and he walked to the side door of the barn, and he tried the key, and it turned. The barn was dark and full of cold. He swept the headlamp across the inside. There was hay in one corner, there were tools hanging on the walls in the precise order of a man who had cared deeply about his tools. There was an old Ford 9N tractor under a tarp, and there against the back wall, under a heavier tarp that had been carefully sealed at off every edge with wire, was the snowcat. He pulled the tarp off. It was a motnin beimitam, tucker snowcat, mutnam bormin high. 2-tracked. Diesel. Painted Forest Service green. The cab had been built for Hager Hat country work. The grille was clean. The tracks were sound. There was a small placard above the dash that said in Daniel Brennan's hand, started monthly. Oil changed October Mortintam Mui. He climbed in, he found the keys in the ignition, he pulled the choke, he turned the key, the starter ground, he gave it more throttle, he turned the key again, the starter ground for a longer time. The engine coughed, it coughed again, it caught. It settled into a low, hard idle that was the idle of a 46-year-old engine being asked to wake up Mott -51 degrees, and Jax sat in the cab of a dead man's machine and let it warm up and laid his hands on the steering wheel and breathed. He did not believe in many things. He believed in this one. He drove the snowcat out of the barn in a slow lurch through the snow that the snowmobile had not been able to manage. The tracks chewed through the drifts as if the drifts were not there. He drove back to the highway. He drove down the highway to where Wendell and Garrett were waiting beside the dead Yamaha. The two of them climbed into the cab beside him. The cab was cold. He turned the heater on. The cold air it put out was at least warmer than the air outside. He drove the snowcat up the access road and back to the lodge. It took 11 minutes. He pulled up to the porch at 5:31 in the morning. He killed the engine. He helped Wendell out of the cab with the duffel of oxygen. He went up onto the porch ahead of him. He opened the door of the lodge. The lodge held 61 degrees and the kerosene light was orange, and Smoky was at the door before the door was fully open. She read his face. Her tail moved once. He stepped past her. Wendell came in behind him. Doris was still on the floor against the wall. Her breathing was shallow and fast. Her colour was worse. Cole was beside her. Hattie was at the head of the bunk, watching with her hand on Wilma S.'s shoulder. Lila Tate was sitting up on the flagstone with her arms around Smoky's neck. Wendell crossed the floor in 3 long strides. He went down on his knees. He pulled the small portable concentrator out of the duffel. He pulled the cannula out of its sealed package. He unwound the tubing. He set the dial. He fitted the cannula over his wife's ears and across her nose. He turned the unit on. The unit hummed. For a long moment nothing changed. Then Doris's chest, which had been working in the small fast catching pattern, took a single long deep breath. The cannula whistled with it. Her ribs lifted in a way they had not lifted since the moment she had slid down the wall. She opened her eyes. She looked at her husband. She lifted one hand to his face. She said, in a voice that was paper-thin but clear, Wendell. Wendell said, "Mott am here." Doris. "Mott am here." She said, "Mott am all right." Wendell said, "Mut kanurve kep." He laid his forehead against hers. He held it there. He could not speak. Jack stepped back from the scene. He went to the small pine table in the corner. He sat down. He put his hands flat on the wood. After a while, Wendell came across the lodge to him. He sat down on the bench across from Jack. He laid his hands flat on the wood the way Jack's had laid his. He said, "Mr. Harlan." Jack said, "Wendell." Wendell said, "I owe you my wife's life." Jack said, "No, you do not." Wendell said, "Mott do." Jack said, "We are even." Wendell said, "How?" Jack said, "Because we are both still standing." Wendell looked at him for a long beat. He did not say anything. He nodded slowly. He stood up. He walked back across the lodge to his wife. He sat down on the floor beside her and he put his hand on her hand on top of where Smoky S. muzzle had been 20 hours earlier. Hattie was at the table. She had moved without him noticing. She sat down on the bench across from him in the spot Wendell had just vacated. She had a small wooden box in her hands that he had not seen before. The box was the size of a paperback book. The wood was old and dark. It had a small brass clasp. She said, "Mott went to the locker yesterday before you came to get me. Mott took this out. Mott have had it in the inside pocket of my coat since you brought me here. Mott was waiting to know when to give it to you." She set the box on the table between them. She opened the clasp. She took out a single black and white photograph. She laid it face up on the wood. The photograph was a Mochin Salmichin squad portrait, 8 men in jungle utilities standing in front of a Huey on a red dirt landing zone. The men were arranged in 2 rows of 4, the front row kneeling, the back row standing. Daniel Brennan was in the back row, second from the left. He had a cigarette in his hand. His eyes had not yet decided whether they were going to be kind or hard. Standing in the front row, kneeling, second from the right, was a young lieutenant in his early 20s. Hattie put her finger on the Lieutenant S face. She said, "That is Daniel S. commanding officer in Morningshin Salmichin, the lieutenant of his recon platoon. James Shaw." Jax looked at the photograph. He looked at the lieutenant. He looked at the name. He did not speak. The room around him went very still. Hattie said, "His grandfather was your grandfather." Jax did not move. She said, "Mott knew when you told me your name in the parking lot in August. Mott did not say anything because Mott needed to be sure. Mott went home and Mott went to the locker, and Mott pulled out the box of letters that they wrote to each other. James wrote to Dan every Christmas from Morningshin Baimi Mort until Dan died in Morningshin Tami Mort. He wrote 11 letters. Dan wrote back to him every Christmas. Dan S. drafts are in the box. James kept the originals. Mott do not know what happened to them. They mention you in the later years. Dan asked about you. James wrote about you. There is a letter from Morningshin Baimichin in which James describes his eldest grandson, a quiet boy of 7 who liked to take things apart and put them back together. He does not say his name. He says, "My eldest grandson, the boy is you." Jack sat very still. The lodge around him was warm. The kerosene light was orange. Wendell was on the floor with his wife. Hattie was across the table. He said, "Hattie." She said, "Mott Kanovi kept." He said, "Mott did not buy your land." She said, "You did not. You came home to it." He looked at the photograph for a long time. He looked at his grandfather S. face, the same face that had given him the paperback book in Mochin Chin Misao, with a look that had said, "You will need this someday, son," and had not explained. And he saw the look form, and he saw the line that ran from a kneeling lieutenant in Morningshin Salmichin through a man named Daniel Brennan, who had laid stones on the side of a Montana ridge, and through a paperback book, and through a small grandson taking apart a transistor radio, and through 11 months of sleeping in a truck, and through an old woman carrying magazines out of a post office in August. And he saw the line for what it was, which was not a coincidence and not destiny, but simply the long, slow, patient work of the men and women who had come before him, deciding across half a century to leave him a place to stand when he came home. He stood up from the table. He walked to the door of the lodge. He opened it. The cold pressed in at -51 degrees, but the lodge held its 61. He stepped out onto the porch in his shirt sleeves. He looked across the valley at the dark ridge across the way and the stars above. He breathed in the cold once deeply. He breathed it out. He went back inside. He closed the door. He sat down at the table beside Hattie. He laid his hand on top of her hand on the wood. He held it there for a long count of 10. He said, "Thank you." She did not answer. She did not need to. He stood up again. He walked across the lodge. Wendell was sitting on the floor beside Doris with his hand on her hand and his head against the wall and his eyes closed. He had not slept in 28 hours. Cole and Garrett were on the flagstone beside their parents. They had fallen asleep where they sat. Jax took a wool blanket from the foot of the bunk. He unfolded it. He laid it across Wendell and Doris together. He laid the corner of it over Cole. He smoothed it once at the shoulders. He did not say anything. Lila Tate was awake on the flagstone beside Smoky. She had been watching him. She said, in the small whisper of an 8-year-old at 5:43 in the morning, mister. He went down on one knee beside her. He said yes. Sweetheart, she said, is your dog magic? He looked at Smoky. The dog looked back at him. Her amber eyes were calm. Her tail moved once against the flagstone. He said, she listens better than people. Lila said, she is listening to me right now. Mort knows she is. Smoky's tail moved once more. The little girl smiled. She put her face into the dog's neck and closed her eyes. He stood up. He walked back to the table. Hattie was still sitting there with the photograph in front of her. He sat down across from her. The lodge held 61 degrees. Outside, the cold sat in the valley at -51 and did not move. The fire in the hearth burned low. He fed it one small log. The log caught. The flame rose. The orange light moved up the wall opposite the southeast windows. The sun came up over Bramble Ridge at 7:14 in the morning of the 5th day. The light came through the southeast windows of the lodge in 2 long slanting bars and laid itself across the flagstone floor and across the sleeping bodies and across the bunk where 2 old women were curled toward Eok Shea Hat Other and across the dog and the little girl beside her and across the man and the wife sleeping under a single wool blanket with their hands intertwined. And the light reached the small pine table at the back of the lodge and laid a soft, warm bar across the photograph of a kneeling lieutenant in Mochin Saungchin and across the letter on yellow paper that had been written in Mochin Tamui by a man who had not lived to see the man it was written for. And Jax Harlan sat at the table in the bar of light and watched 12 people sleep, and he did not know what he was, but he knew, for the first time in a long time, where he was. He was home. He had not been alone in arriving. The freeze broke on the 7th day. The grid came back on the 9th. The roads were cleared on the 11th. By the end of the 2nd week, the people who had slept in his lodge had gone home. The town did not throw him a parade. The town did not need to. Wendell Crane began selling him lumber at the same price he sold it to anyone else. Don Holloway resigned the building inspector position in March without a public statement. Sheriff Reeves drove up the access road in April and sat on the porch of the lodge with a cup of coffee for an hour and did not say much and did not need to. The Tate family invited him to Sunday dinner once a month. He went. He hung the bronze star on the wall above the bunk in May. The medal had been in the tin in the duffel for 9 years. The nail had been in the wall since November. The medal fit the nail. A year later, on a late October morning, he was on the south berm of the lodge packing fresh earth onto the joint where the sod had begun to thin at the ridge line. The temperature was 34 degrees. The cold was coming. Smoky was up on the granite outcrop watching the road. He looked up because she had moved. Hattie Brennan was walking up the access road. Scout was behind her, slow on his hips at 15. She had a thermos in her hand. She came up the slope and she stood at the base of the lodge, and she watched him work for a while without speaking. He worked. The shovel rang against the half-frozen ground. After a long time she came up onto the porch and she set the thermos on the small table he had built there, and she sat down on the bench beside it. He came down off the berm. He took off his gloves. He sat on the porch step at her feet. She poured him coffee. He drank it. The sun moved behind Bramble Ridge. He handed her the empty thermos. He nodded once. She nodded back. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today.
The Heroic Veteran Dogs is a fictional channel created to entertain, educate, and inspire the audience by exploring the deep, loyal bond between veterans and their dogs. All channel content does not represent real individuals, actual events, or documented cases. Any resemblance to real people, animals, or events is entirely coincidental.